So I think we're good to go. So once again, a very warm welcome to all good colleagues from across the world, wherever you're linking in from. We have very strong attendance. It seems like word of mouth is spreading to friends and colleagues about this course, and more people are registering and linking in, which is very encouraging. Very happy to see that people are enjoying the course, feel that they are benefiting from it. That's great. We've got strong attendance from Africa, from all over Asia, and that's really wonderful to see. So again, welcome to you all to this APMEN course on malaria vector surveillance presented by Professor Neil Lobo. Let me remind you that this course is based very strongly or entirely on the ESPT tool produced by a joint collaboration between University of California, San Francisco and University of Notre Dame. So the whole course, the background documentation, you can access from the ESPT tool, which you can find at the URL. Just type into Google ESPT MEI. That stands for Entomological Surveillance Planning Tool, Malaria Elimination Initiative. So in Google, just type in ESPT MEI and it should pop up. So again, it's going to be about 2 hours, maybe half an hour extra given the 10-minute break that we'll build in again halfway across the duration. So we'll have 1 hour lecture time, roughly 10-minute break, and then roughly another hour after that. So 2.5 hours. I'd like to remind our audience members, please, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a number of boxes there. There's a chat box, and it's great if in the chat box you insert comments and announce who you are. Say, welcome everybody, I am so-and-so from so-and-so country. That's for general conversation and so on. Then there's also the Q&A box. And if you have questions, and we encourage you to ask questions, please put all your questions in the Q&A box. We will only monitor the Q&A box for questions. So for general comments, chat box. For questions, Q&A box, please. Final comment from me is that the session will again, as the previous 2 days, everything is being recorded and it will be uploaded into 2 sites. It will be uploaded onto the aurene.org site. Wulan will copy the URL into the chat box, and it will also be uploaded into YouTube. And again, Dr. Porn or Wulan will put the URL in the chat box. So there are 2 sources where you can access the full course. Everything that is being lectured on will be uploaded onto YouTube and that Aurene website. So again, we're very fortunate to have Professor Neil Lobo, a top quality person to present this course to us. And I'm going to hand over to Neil. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating, and to Neil for your presentations. Over to you, Neil.
Hey, everyone. I'm Neil. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm going to start sharing my screen. I think that's it. Correct. I think that's it. I hope you all can see my screen. Over the last 2 days, we went over how to conduct question-based entomological surveillance, and went over the theory behind why and multiple aspects and examples of each decision we would make which includes how to ask a question, what indicators to select to answer our question, as well as sampling methods. Today, we will look at sites and survey types, and a couple of presentations after that. We should have 3 shorter presentations today. And if we have time, we'll go over a specific example of a good implementation of entomological surveillance. And tomorrow, we plan to work through examples of this on the little ESPT. We will start off now on going over selecting sites and survey types. Work. Perfect. So in this presentation, we will try and understand the different types of entomological surveillance, the different kinds of sites, as well as the different kinds of surveys we can conduct. Now, please note that this is more sort of an academic approach to what we're doing. It's sort of definitions of what we're doing and how we could do it, but it may not necessarily impact how you actually conduct the surveillance. Although, for example, if you do routine surveillance, you know you're going to be going back to the site. So it's sort of good to define exactly what you're doing for greater understanding. We will look over how to select sites, as well as how to most efficiently select sites based on your priority program question and available resources. If you remember the ESPT, the first step is what is your question? Then you select your minimal essential indicators that answer your question, and then sampling methods that collect your indicators that answer your question. So today we'll be going over the last 3, which is site selection, sampling design, and how to incorporate capacity and funding into this. So that's site selection now. So there are 3 kinds of sites that we define, right? A sentinel site, a focus site, and a targeted site. Now, what are each of them? A sentinel site is a fixed site, as in we don't move it. We keep going back to that site. It's usually a part of a network of sites that is representative of a different transmission system. So, for example, you could have sentinel sites in high transmission areas, medium transmission areas, and elimination areas. And the reason for looking at sentinel sites is to look at trends over time. Since we go back to that same site repeatedly, we can see how things change over time, whether it's over seasons within a year or between years, or even before and after you implement an intervention. We can understand how well our intervention's functioning. So a sentinel site has a specific purpose, and this is the primary type of site that most countries use. They use sentinel sites, go back to that site, try to figure out what's happening over time. The next kind of site is a focus site, and this is defined as a current or former malarious area, and it is usually based on epidemiology. For example, if we have an outbreak, right, we would go to that site and try and understand what's happening there. And focus sites are usually, focus site investigations, for example, are usually conducted so that we can understand what is the most effective response, what we can do at that site to reduce and interrupt transmission. We can actually go to a focus site multiple times or just once based on what your question is. Now, a targeted site is a site where we would do something just once. And that's based on a specific question, and it can be a really random question. For example, has Anopheles stevensii invaded our country at this site? And you can go there and do a survey, and that's a targeted site for a quick spot survey. So those are your 3 definitions of site types. Now, survey types. At each of these site types, we can conduct surveys. Now, we've defined these surveys as 4 categories. The first one is a baseline survey. And as the name suggests, we go to do a survey there that will help characterize what's happening at that site. We want to know what's happening. This will inform us as to what the vectors are doing, the potential of an intervention. It can inform a foci response, right? As well as evaluating existing interventions. And the reason we add this in, evaluating existing interventions, is because sometimes we don't have baseline data for those sites. and we have already implemented an intervention. So when we go to that site and we do a survey, since we don't have any data for that site, we don't have entomological behavioral data, for example, that first survey will be a baseline survey. And that survey will sort of form the foundation of understanding of what's happening at that site, whether the intervention's there or not. The next kind of survey is a routine survey. And the routine surveys at routine sites are used to inform and monitor changes at that site. And those changes can be in vector population over time. It can look at monitoring the impact of an intervention. It can look at human behavioral changes over time. It can look at multiple things. You can also look at changes in gaps in protection, as in you do a baseline survey at a site, then you keep going back to that site, you implement an intervention, and over time, you can see how that intervention has impacted your vector population with routine surveys. And then you can also see how your mosquitoes respond with routine surveys. For example, they might change their behaviors or they might have insecticide resistance. So routine surveys are also usually conducted at routine sites, of course, but in countries. Now, a focus survey, also like a focus site, at a focus site, is used to gather important epidemiological, entomological, and environmental and intervention data. So multiple types of data, all those that inform and drive transmission so we can understand what to do to stop it. And focus sites where we would look at an outbreak, for example, we can use focus surveys at these sites to understand what to do. I worded that really badly, but I think you understand what I mean. We would use a focus survey at a focus site to understand how to slow down transmission. And we'd look at the mosquitoes, we'd look at humans, we'd look at the environment and the interventions there. I tried to reword it better. A spot survey, again, like a spot site, is a short survey. It's time-bound that targets a specific question. So, for example, we do an entomological survey at a site to understand if Anopheles stevensii has invaded there. So, as to briefly summarize that, we have 3 kinds of sites, which are sentinel, focus, and targeted, and 4 types of surveys, which are baseline, routine, foci, and spot surveys. And we would do different things at each one. So your site should be selected based on your program objective. And another word for objective is, which I'm going to keep saying 500 times, is what is your question, right? What is your question? So you'd select your site based on your question. Your survey type ideally would answer that question and would be directed by what the program wants to know. You'd want to select your sites based on your question, and that might include the heterogeneity of malaria transmission and geographic variation in malaria transmission in your country. For example, if you want to understand what's happening across your country, you might want to pick high transmission areas, low transmission areas, medium transmission areas, and overlap that with different ecological systems. For example, desert systems or oasis systems or forest systems or savanna systems. So that way your site selection would be representative of what's happening, but have it be representative of your question. A huge factor in site selection is program capacity and resources, which basically boils down to money and how many people are available to actually conduct this. Ideally, if you had a choice, I would suggest going to areas with higher malaria transmission. Sorry, I meant if you don't have a choice and you have limited resources, go to an area with higher malaria transmission, and perhaps your data you get from there can inform these most vulnerable people, the people with the highest amount of malaria. That's what I would do. If you had more resources, I'd move to areas with lower malaria transmission. So if you look at the ESPT, which I hope you've downloaded, I have another slide on where and when to download this later on. At table 10 looks at survey types and links them to the site type. If you look at the ESPT figure 3 on page 26, there's a decision tree on how to select your site based on your program objective. And this is figure 3, and I hope you can read this. The lettering is a bit small. So site selection. So here are three groups of objectives. For example, on the left, the first objective is we want to gather baseline data or monitor trends over time, evaluate interventions, or to evaluate other program-specific questions across representative sites. Now you'd use a Sentinel site. And the two things you do after that is determine if they're receptive or not, right? If it's receptive, you'd stratify by current epidemiology. And we just had a whole bunch of categories over here, various amounts of transmission. And then you'd integrate your interventions. Does your site have BedNets or IRS or, for example, Mass Drug Administration? So what's happening with regards to interventions at that site? Because you want that to be representative of what's happening. And then, for example, you could draw operational units across districts and then pick at least one Sentinel site per strata. And the strata would be based on your operational units, your BedNet coverage, the amount of malaria you have, your entomology, all those things. If it's non-receptive, you'd obviously want to do a spot survey and not have to go back there a lot. Your second sort of group of objectives would be to guide foci responses or to answer specific programmatic questions in a foci. And that would be a foci of transmission. We're looking at epidemiology mostly. It's driven by epidemiology. And you'd have questions based on if your site was active, if there's active transmission, if there was if it's a residual non-active site, or if there's cleared, if there's no malaria there. So you can ask specific foci-based questions out there. And of course, the last group is to answer specific questions that are outside Sentinel sites and foci. You'd look at spot surveys in targeted sites. These may be driven by epidemiology. You can answer multiple questions, very random things sometimes based on that. So you can reference this figure 3 in the ESPT.
Neil,
Oops.
sorry, there's a question here from somebody who's a bit confused, and
Yes.
it probably reflects that there are others as well.
Okay.
Please, can someone clarify the difference between a focus site and a target site? So could you just clarify that again?
Okay, we would define, hold on, let me go back a second. So a focus site, right, would be one that's driven by epidemiology, right? So a focus is usually a focus of transmission, a focus based on epidemiology. So for example, if you have an outbreak, you want to figure out how specifically at a site to reduce the transmission there. So your question would be based on the epidemiology happening there, and you'd want to have a response based on the epidemiology to reduce that. While a targeted site can be anything. It could be the targeted site includes many, many different kinds of questions. For example, has Anopheles stevensii invaded my site? I want to go in there and just look at the species composition in this forested site on an area of high diversity or biodiversity. You can look at a quick question like, I implemented IRS at this site, and how did that impact vectors? You can just do a one-time survey there and leave. So your targeted site isn't necessarily driven by epidemiology, but your focus site would be driven by epidemiology. I hope that explained it. You're right that sometimes this can get a bit overlapping and confusing, and we've sort of compartmentalized these definitions. And as I mentioned at the beginning, don't be driven by these definitions. This is just sort of to allow us to understand the direction, what we'd be focusing on and what our question is, so we can focus on how to respond and what data to collect. I hope that was helpful to understand. So I went over this slide and here, focus sites. Here's the slide on that actually. So for example, this would be entomological surveillance as part of a focus investigation. I forgot I had a slide on this. So this would be key to informing a response. That's another part of that, not just epidemiology, but also a response. And so that the different kinds of sites, which are active, residual, non-active, and cleared, as I mentioned. So we'd want a focus would be based on epidemiology, and the decision is what kind of response would we have. I hope that was helpful. And targeted sites, again, a targeted site might be, for example, just as an example, there's a malaria outbreak and you want to understand the drivers of this outbreak, and you just go there once. This can also, as you very rightly just said, can overlap with focus site, right? Because you want to understand the drivers here, but not necessarily respond to it. So there is overlap, considerable overlap between these, but it hopefully will guide you to understand what data to collect and how to focus down your indicators you collect. So your question will decide both your site and your survey type. And as an example, I have this picture from a recent publication, which is from Papua in Indonesia, where there is the highest amount of transmission here. And the question was, what are the entomological drivers of transmission across Papua? And so based on the API in 21.8, these are the circles, the bigger circles, the bigger, more malaria. They selected, we looked at those areas, the darker green areas, and the X's marked the sentinel sites that they used to collect data to understand the mosquito drivers of transmission in those areas. This is just an example. And I know there are going to be lots of questions, but please realize that these definitions don't necessarily dictate, but they will hopefully help you decide how to direct what you do. Are there any questions? That was just the end of that short presentation.
Yes, Neil, sorry, can I ask you, there are two questions in
Yes,
the Q&A box.
yes,
It's probably easier if you just read them there, Neil.
yes,
Just
I
two.
have it in front of me.
Excellent,
The
yeah.
first question is from APMEN. Hey, I know you. How are you? In entomological surveillance, what are the important activities conducted in outbreak investigation? Which meteorological factors influence the outbreak situation, and can we choose the sentinel site in outbreak areas? So this is a complicated question. So in an outbreak, which would be, as we just talked about, a focus investigation, that should technically be driven by epidemiology because we want to respond to the epidemiology. If you go to the ESPT, there's a specific decision tree based on that. And there are two sections. One of them is epidemiology, what you'd want to do. And the second part is entomologically. I would select sites with the highest transmission. And first of all, look at what interventions are present there and give people interventions that map to how the mosquitoes are behaving in that area to stop onward transmission. So our entomological investigation would include mapping or understanding what the mosquitoes are doing relative to the interventions that we can distribute there. For example, if we can give everyone bed nets, try and understand where and when the mosquitoes are feeding and what the humans are doing, where they're being bitten, conduct human behavioral observations. And if IRS is there, I'd look and see if the mosquitoes are resting on walls. And can we choose a sentinel site in an outbreak area? Of course, you can definitely choose a sentinel site in an outbreak area. So that sentinel site will tell you trends over time in an area prone to outbreaks. And that's actually kind of important because the second you have an outbreak, you'll actually have a lot of data in that area. That's a great question. The second question is, I'm interested to work on impact of climate change on vectors in Pakistan. So which survey or study types should I conduct? So since you're looking at climate change, now this is over time, right? So you would want to know what happens and how things change over time. So this is from Alia Jabim in Pakistan. And what I would do is have sites that are representative of different regions in Pakistan. And while I am looking at the vectors and their behaviors over time at that site and across seasons, right, I would also map all the climatic factors that might drive the specific vectors. So the things that can be impacted is movement of vectors into different regions based on climate change. You can have increases or decreases of population. You can have changes in behaviors. For example, if it's too hot, they might go into houses more. You can have all these changes. You can have seasonal differences where changes in rainfall can completely change when larval sites are available. So when you look at the climatic conditions that you're investigating, I would try and understand how that might impact my vectors, not just my vector species, but also their behaviors. And then based on what's happening in your country and your different ecological types, because each ecology will have different vector species, I would then try and monitor that over time and map that and link the two, the climate changes to your vector species and their compositions and what they're doing. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for that. I think all the questions have been answered, so we can move on if you wish to.
Perfect. So my next, if I can find I can find the screen. Here you go. The next presentation, can you see my screen, I hope? Yes. Is on sampling design for operational purposes. Please note, even though this is operational, you can map this to academic studies. And the picture is actually from Myanmar, Dr. Mint. The picture is from Myanmar when I was there with you, who just asked a question. So the learning objectives for this section is to try and understand how to develop a sampling plan based on your primary question with available capacity and resources, how to develop an optimal plan. And also the second part is looking at data, and we look at the importance of data standardization and quality in the context of your available capacity and resources. We know that below is each of the steps of the ESPT, and we are now going to look over sampling design. So the key concepts here are a sampling site, a sampling unit, and the sample size. Now, the sampling site is basically where we collect the data from, right? The collection locality from where mosquito samples are collected to obtain relevant data to measure the indicators selected. Please note that we can collect a lot more than just mosquito data. And I would change the sentence to mosquito plus human data plus intervention data, whatever data, whatever indicators we're going to collect to answer our question, that would be at our sampling site. A sampling unit. Now, this is the individual unit for which mosquito collection will be conducted within a sampling site. For example, this could be a village, this could be a house, this could be a water body, this could be a person, right? So if we're looking at the number of mosquitoes that enter a house at night or rest on walls in the morning, your sampling unit would be a house, right? So we'll have a village where we're looking at IRS. That would be the sampling site. The sampling unit within that village would be a house. And the sample size is the number of sampling units that we actually use. The number of sampling units allocated within a sampling site. So this would be the number of houses where we conduct our sampling. So we have a sampling site, a sampling unit, and our sampling size. So when we're making an optimal sampling design, we want to go through these 5 steps. The first step is determine the sampling site. Where do we go to collect our data? Which villages? And these can be selected by multiple reasons or multiple drivers, and we will go over that. The second part is to determine the sampling unit. In this little picture, it is a house. And step 3 is to select or allocate the sampling units. Since most of us cannot collect at every single house in that village, we'll have to select which ones we're going to work in. The fourth step is to factor in the sampling method. Now, we already talked about the sampling method, but since we already talked about it, we're not going to go about this in detail, but we want to factor that into the sampling design, into this step, as in how will the sampling method impact our sampling unit and the number of sampling units we can actually conduct. And then step 5 is set the frequency of sampling. So in step 1, we'll go over each one of these steps now. Step 1, we want to determine the sampling site, right? So we figure out where we want to collect our data, and let's say it's in multiple villages in an area that has high transmission. Now we want to figure out which sampling sites we will use. Now we basically, there are so many ways to do this. We have to figure out how many villages we go to, and you can figure this out on a map, or you can figure it out based on the amount of malaria going on in high transmission villages, right? A lot of times sampling sites are directed by your question, as in what is my question? And that'll tell you which are your ideal sampling sites. A lot of the time, as I mentioned earlier, limited capacity and resources, the amount of money you have, as well as the amount of people you have to conduct this, or the number of vehicles, or the number of traps, will also limit the size and the number of sampling sites, right? In step 1, in table 11, you can look at examples of sampling sites for 3 common program questions. You can look at examples there. Yeah. For step, here's an example on table 11. These are example questions with corresponding appropriate sampling sites. So let's say a question now. Where are the villagers in village X? Let's say the name of the village is X. Where are they exposed to Anopheles mosquitoes? Now, we don't know where they're being exposed, so we probably want to have sampling sites in village X, plus other areas where villages are present during Anopheles biting times, right? So, for example, if we go to village X and we find out that there's a fisherman village, or let's say surrounded by forests where people go to collect, let's say, wood, to answer the question, where are most people exposed? I would look at Village X plus areas surrounding Village X where people go to, because they could be exposed in either one of those areas. So factor in human behavior, what they're doing, based on your question. Another question is, let's say health facility A and B are reporting high numbers of malaria cases, and we want to understand what the entomological drivers of this outbreak are, right? And obviously, since health facility A and B are reporting abnormally high numbers of malaria cases, we want to go to health facility A and B catchment area. So we would select villages in the catchment area of A and B, health facility A and B. This makes common sense, right? I hope so, right? So the last question is there presence or absence of insecticide resistance to the active ingredient used for IRS or L Alliance in region Y, right? Is there insecticide resistance? So we would go to the sites in region Y where we are already collecting data, or we can choose sentinel sites there where the intervention is deployed. We obviously don't want to go to areas where there's no IRS and L Alliance, because we want to see if that is associated with insecticide resistance. So this is an example, 3 examples of how to select your sampling sites. And here's an example of an area, and this is in Morumbala, I think, in Mozambique, where we're actually conducting a study. And based on our question, which was to look at entomological drivers of transmission, these were the sites selected, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this is where we're collecting data. And each one of those orange circles represents a village. The second step is to determine the sampling unit. So a sampling unit can be almost anything based on your question, right? It can be a house, a cattle shed, a forest, a water body if you're doing larval sampling, correct? Right? And so your question will dictate what your sampling unit will be. The indicators you have to use to answer your question will also guide you in deciding on the appropriate sampling unit. For example, if you're looking at HBR, or the human biting rate, inside and outside homes, then the sampling unit would be a single home, right? It is really important to standardize your sampling unit across all your selected sampling sites. And this is so that you can compare your data. You don't want to have different sampling units for different sites, because you cannot compare them. An example below is if you're looking at larval density of anopheles in artificial larval sites, the sampling unit must be a single artificial larval site. You don't want to include natural sites there, because that's not your question. You're looking at artificial larval sites. In table 12, you have example questions with corresponding sampling units and selection criteria. We can go over a quick example. If we're looking at the human biting location and anopheles in an area or in a village, the indicator, since it's human biting, we'd look at the human biting rate, and the sampling unit can be houses and other structures in the village. For example, if the question is based on just what the human biting rate is in houses, you would pick a house. But let's say people are hanging outside at night in bars all the time, You pick houses and bars, or inside and outside houses. So you can define your question and narrow down on your sampling unit. And unit selection criteria might be inhabited houses where humans are living, correct? Because you might not want to sample in houses where there's no one living. And as I mentioned, spaces where people are present during biting times, right? For example, in outdoor cooking shelters. In Zambia, we have lots of outdoor cooking shelters. So since people are there when mosquitoes are biting, and our question is to look at the human biting location, we might want to select those areas as well. That as a unit. Sorry, I meant we might want to select outdoor cooking shelters as a unit as well. Whoops, I forgot about all these animations. So the next step is to allocate your sampling unit. We want to pick which one of these houses or which of these outdoor cooking shelters we want to utilize for collection, right? The allocation of the sampling unit means a selection of sampling units that will be included in our study. To support the allocation of units, how to pick these units, we can consider historical data. For example, if we already have data from that site and some of those units have already been selected, or some of those houses, for example, have already been selected, we might want to continue with those since we might have data associated with that and we can look at trends. Of course, this is based on your question. And assess how many sampling units to do. So for example, if we pick, do we pick 1? Do we pick 5? Do we pick 500, right? So this is a huge question, actually. And I'm pretty sure a bunch of you are going to ask, so how much should we do? And I'm going to get to this in a second because the answer is actually very, very vague. And we're trying to understand this right now. So if you look at the bottom, you can see step 1 is identifying your sampling site, which village we're working in. Then the second one is identifying your unit. Over here, it's a house. And step 3 is deciding on which of those sampling units, allocating those houses and how many of them, which is your sampling size. And in this site, we're in Morambala in Mozambique, we selected those sampling sites. Whoops, this didn't work. It was supposed to zoom in. Ah, yes, we zoom in and then to the village, and then we picked those 4 units of a house to do our collections in. Next. Okay. Now the next step is where we factor in the sampling methods. Now the sampling method may actually have a huge impact on the data and whether the question was appropriately addressed. As you know, the sampling method collects the indicators that answer your question. So factoring this correct selection or the most appropriate selection of your sampling method is vital. We went through this earlier on yesterday about the pros and cons, the biases, advantages, and disadvantages of each sampling method. By now, you should have already selected your sampling method, so we will not go over that again. Your sampling method actually will decide a lot of things. For example, if you're doing human landing catches, you're going to have to figure out how much they cost, how many people you can hire. And let's say you can only afford 10 people, maybe you can only do 10 houses inside only, or 5 houses inside and outside. Or if you're going to use CDC light traps, and if you have only 20 CDC light traps, and if you're working inside and outside houses, 1 inside, 1 outside, you can only do 10 houses. So sampling method, a lot of the times, will decide for you your sample size. Standardization of sampling across all units is critical, as I mentioned earlier. Step 5 is the frequency of sampling. How many times do we go back? Now, this is dependent on your question, as well as I mentioned earlier, the amount of money and people you have. As always, more sampling is always better to have, but quality of data should always be prioritized over quantity. Better quality data is always better than quantity. A key point is representative. That is a key word there. When we're looking at operational entomological surveillance, what we want is representative data. And I have a couple of slides after this, and hopefully that will help us understand better or direct us into how much sampling to do. How many sites to go to? What is the frequency of sampling? The frequency of sampling should also be decided for within each sampling period, of course. For example, we selected houses as a sampling unit. Do we go back to these structures every month? How many of those structures each month? And for each time we go back every month, how many days do we collect data, right? So all this factors into your sampling size and how we actually collect the data. Uh, Step 5 is also the frequency of sampling, right? How often do we go back? And a lot of the times, this is based on the question and available resources. And here's an example in the ESPT. The timing and frequency of sampling, and the question is, what is the residual efficacy of a new active ingredient for IRS? Now, based on your resources, option 1 is to sample immediately, is to conduct your residual efficacy studies immediately following spraying of that new active ingredient, and then do it every month until Anopheles mortality is below 80%, and that is from WHO. So let's say it lasts, let's say it actually lasts 8 months. We can conduct it every month until we find Anopheles mortality below 80%, which would be 8 months, and perhaps 9 months if we have enough resources to see if it further drops. If you have limited resources, then we can start sampling immediately following spraying and then do it every 2 months, so every 3 months, right? Or just 6 months post spraying, right? Until we sort of understand when Anopheles mortality drops below 80%. So we conduct our sampling based on our resources here and our question, but we try and maximize it to get the best data possible. And here's an example of frequency of sampling throughout the year. We have 4 options. Let's say we're looking at Anopheles species composition. Your question is, what is my Anopheles species composition or Anopheles vector composition? If you have a ton of money, you can go back every month and collect data for 5 months, 5 days, every month in 5 houses every single time. If you have less money, you can go every second month, right? If you have even less money, you can go every third month. And if you have very, very little resources and you want to understand your vectors, perhaps you can just go twice during the sampling season in option 4. And of course, all these are just made up examples, and you'd want to select your sampling, your frequency of sampling, your sampling framework based on your question, your resources, and hopefully the amount of people you have as well. So here's a very important question, and we can actually discuss this for hours. I'm going to go through this briefly, and I hope it makes sense because it's actually the first time I'm presenting this. So how much do we actually need to sample? So when we look at academic studies, right, research, where we actually have tons of funds, we require to be able to publish, we need things like statistical significance and power calculations. And a lot of times this requires a lot of data, right? Operational studies don't require this level of statistical significance or confidence. What we need is data that's representative of our question that can help us direct us in decision making. We don't need statistical significance because that requires way too much money. If we had that much money, I would be so happy. And if you do have that money, please conduct your studies with statistical significance. But somehow my experience says that a lot of people operationally do not have the money to do statistical significance. As an example, for the larger space repellent trials that we conducted in the past, to be able to have statistical significance with the entomological data, we needed the exact same amount of money that we had needed for epidemiological significance, which was a couple of $1 million. No one's going to spend that money on entomology. So we actually had to scale down and try and get representative data. So the primary question is, how do we maximize our data quality with our limited budgets, right? Because we want to make the best decisions based on the best evidence. We want to produce the best evidence. And this little figure below, I'm going to take a second to try and explain it, and I hope this makes sense to you. On the left, on this axis, we have the mean number of mosquitoes from multiple evaluations of the right axis. So it says houses sampled, but it's actually sampling nights. So if you do over here, right here, is one sampling night. If you conduct one sampling night, and over here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In each night, you might get different numbers of mosquitoes, right? The mean number of mosquitoes from one sampling night can be quite variable. Now, let's say overall I had 200 sampling nights, and I took every combination of 2 sampling nights and found the mean of it. What we find is that there's less variation. Now, we took every combination of 3 sampling nights, right? And then looked at the mean of it, which is on the left, we'd find less variation. And what we find is, obviously, the more we sample, the less variation we have. And if you sample 200 households, 200 sampling nights, what we find is it's about 11 and a half mosquitoes per house. Now, if we realize that 11 and a half mosquitoes is in that general area, that's the number of mosquitoes per house. That's a representative number. How much do we actually have to sample for this number to be informative? For example, if we sample one house, we'd have so much variation, we don't know if it's real, all the way from 16 to, I guess that's 5 maybe. So what is representative of the number of mosquitoes entering a house? So perhaps out here, right? Maybe 50 50 collection nights, or maybe if you have less fun, slightly less, but understanding that the less houses you collect data in, the more variability you're going to get, right? I hope that made sense. I have a couple of slides to look at it in a different manner to hopefully be a little more clear. So if you have historical data from your site, you can actually plot this out by season, by species, and try and see how many sampling nights or how many days of collection, how many houses of collection might give you the most informative and representative data. Keeping in mind that this more sampling is always better, but we need money. So the next sort of slide, hopefully looking at it a different way, is here's mosquito species compositions from a site in Mozambique. 3. How many species did we get? We got 9 species here, and different numbers of each species, 131, 573. And so there's only 1 squamousis and 1 tenebrosus, right? Now, if we're sampling it, right, this is over 1 transmission season. This is the number of mosquitoes we got. So now, let's say our question is, what is the species composition at our site? We want to know all species. Now, please note this is the number of samples we got for each mosquito species. Now, what is the probability of finding at least 1 mosquito of every species if we collect 250 mosquitoes, right? If we collect 250 mosquitoes, the probability of finding every single one of these 9 mosquitoes is almost nothing. And the probability of finding at least 1 of all these mosquitoes, right? Probability is you have to collect 4,750 mosquitoes. That's a lot of mosquitoes to collect to make sure you've actually collected at least 1 of each of these if we're looking at species composition. So for example, we implemented IRS, and let's say we want to say, has IRS impacted Anopheles squamosus? Right? And we want to collect at least 1 Anopheles squamosus to say it's there or not there. We would have to collect at least 4,750 mosquitoes. And this is just statistics. So this way, it's a lot of mosquitoes. However, instead of looking at all 9 mosquitoes, not mosquito species, if we wanted to look at just 3 of them, the primary vectors, if you wanted to say, hey, how has our intervention impacted these primary vectors? I want to see if we can collect at least 1 of them. We have to collect just about 40 mosquitoes. So it's important to see that what is your question? You can define your sampling frame, the amount of sampling you do based on your question. So in this previous example, the question was every species. In this example, it's just your primary vectors. And if you look at this initial figure again, and I'm going to ask a different question here. So we look at the number of sampling nights, and let's say this is our baseline sampling, what we get if we sample at 1 night, 2 night, 3 night, 4 night, 5 nights, the mean variation across. Let's say we put an intervention. Now what happens is the number of mosquitoes per structure may go down, right? And let's say we map that over this. And the second line lower down, let's say it goes from 11.5 to 10 mosquitoes. This is, I'm saying it right now, this is absolutely made up data. Well, the first line is not, but the second line is absolutely made up. This is an example. So let's say the number of mosquitoes goes down from an 11.5 as a mean to 10. Right? Now, if we go to the left and if we sample 2 or 3 houses, there's so much overlap between no intervention and intervention, we might not see a difference, right? And once we come out here to about 50 houses, 52, 53 houses, or house collection nights, we should see a difference. And so this will also tell us how much sampling to conduct if you have this historical data, if you know how much to collect. For example, in this figure, maybe out here, 200 is statistical significance. But at about 50 to 75, you sort of get representative of what's happening. And below that, in this dark black area, is where there's just so much overlap, you don't see it. I apologize if I didn't explain this well, because this is the first time I'm explaining it or presenting it, but I hope it made sense. We're actually working on this with multiple sets of data to try and figure out a strategy that people can implement. The key point is, what is your question? So at this stage, we have looked at how to identify and formulate a priority program question. I've basically gone through the whole ESPT by now. We have learned how to select our entomological and other indicators to answer our question. We have figured out what sampling method would be used to collect our indicators to answer our question. We just went over how to select sites, a sampling design, which hopefully was useful to you. And the next thing is, at this point, once we have done all this, we have an ideal entomological surveillance plan that's based on our question. So we've gone through this whole process and figured out this perfect plan. And a lot of the times, and this happens to me 100% of the time, once you look at your funding and your capacity, it completely messes things up. A lot of the times you do, at least me, I can't afford this operationally. And the next thing to do is to just iterate what we did. We have our ideal plan. I can go to my boss and be like, hey, this is my ideal plan. Do we have the funds for it, right? It costs X dollars. And they'll be like, nope. So I'll go back and try and look through my minimum essential indicators, try and work through our sampling methods, our site selection, our sampling design to try and make it fit our question so we get the best data set to answer our question. I hope that makes sense. There's just one slide on that, but there is a real life example on it coming up. I'll stop for a second now and see if there are any questions.
Can you see my screen, Neil?
I am looking at it right now. Yes.
Okay. So I just picked out 4 random ones out of the about 11 questions there.
So the first question is, for a new invasive vector in a new area, such as Anopheles stevensii, the baseline survey would be a good choice to explore the vector behavior and to how collect the minimum indicator selecting the suitable sites for a survey. How would we pick? I think the question is, how would we pick a site and what indicators would be used? Since we're looking, if we're looking at a site that has not been invaded by Anopheles stevensii, I'd be looking for presence and absence. So what I would do is try and figure out where and when Anopheles stevensii larvae are, where the adults are, and do survey types and indicators based on that. Look at the historical data, look at sites that have invaded Anopheles, have Anopheles stevensii invaded. With Anopheles stevensii, larvae are better indicators than adults because it's easier to collect larvae for Anopheles stevensii. So I would be serving artificial larval sites and other such sites where Anopheles stevensii are known. With regards to adults, I know Anopheles stevensii, based on data, are best collected so far in resting, probably in cowsheds more than households, but they are being found in households as well. And for example, in Sri Lanka, they are found a bunch in wells and places that are humid and dark. In Ethiopia, they've been found in big water containers and water storage vessels and in sewers. So look at the literature, try and find out what other people have done. And since you're looking for an invasive species, direct your indicators and your surveys to those areas, those spaces, and those places where your Anopheles stevensii would be expected to happen, or expected to occur. I hope that that made sense. The second question is, can allocation of sampling unit be random? Absolutely. It is better to be random so that you know you're not biasing your data. Of course, this is also based on your question. For example, if your question is, are mosquitoes present resting more in traditional structures versus concrete structures? You'd want to be randomly selecting your traditional structures and randomly selecting your concrete structures, right? You'd want a representation of both, not just a random selection across your village. Random can be actually a very good thing. What is the minimum distance by which selected homes can be located? So this, of course, is also based on your question. If you're looking at interaction between collection methods, you might want to have a little bit of a distance between them. For example, your PSC in one house may, but not necessarily, but may impact your PSC in the neighbor's house. Another reason for looking at distance would be things like distance to a larval site. There is data that suggests that houses closer to larval sites have higher mosquito numbers than those further away. So you might want to select, depending on your question, right? If your question is, do larval sites predict the number of mosquitoes biting in a household, I'd want to do a selection of households close, medium, and far away from your larval sites. So then you can look at the mosquito landing. And you'd probably, as Dr. Poonam suggested, do a random allocation of select all the houses close and randomly select a few. Select all the houses far away, randomly select a few. So you can do that as well, depending on your question, of course. There's an area with elimination needs surveillance. How long do we need to collect data after elimination? So my enemy of activity to surveillance is funds. You're absolutely right. Can we do surveillance without funds? So here's a very good question, right? As soon as you've eliminated malaria, what processes do you need to make sure that malaria doesn't come back? And again, this is completely based on funds. In the perfect world, if we all had millions of dollars, I'd continue surveillance to make sure that whenever there were, if there, for example, someone came in with malaria and infected the local mosquitoes, I'd be able to respond to that because I know what the mosquitoes are doing. Your responses in an elimination area might be better based on epidemiology. If there are reported malaria cases, you can swoop in and try and do an outbreak response. Or if you find someone with malaria, you can go there quickly to find out, wait, what are the mosquitoes doing? If there's an outbreak, even before the outbreak, you can try and figure out what are the mosquitoes doing so you can implement better interventions or most appropriate interventions. You are right that funds completely dampen this. And sometimes it's hard to tell a boss, like, hey, like I really want to continue my surveillance, but we don't have any funds, and maybe dengue is going up, and maybe we should move funds to dengue. So it is difficult, and I completely understand this. An alternative to actually using funds is using community-based surveillance, where you can actually teach community members to conduct surveillance and get that data from them. It's a lot cheaper. The data quality is usually less, but you can actually have higher resolution of data, a lot more data at a lower quality. And of course, this depends, and it costs money and it needs a bit of funds, but less so than going out yourself every week or every month. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Neil. There are some remaining questions, but like we said yesterday, we will harvest all the questions, and at the end of the course, those questions that have not been responded to, we will respond to the questions. We're going to try and answer all questions, but there are at least 700 of you attending, we can only deal with so many during the particular afternoon. So thank you, Neil. Thank you, audience, for your patience. It's time for our mid-afternoon break or mid-period break. So may I ask, let's take a breather for about 10 minutes and then reconvene. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I hope you all had a good break. I was frantically trying to answer questions, but that's a good thing. So now I have a short presentation on managing entomological data, and then what I think is a really cool presentation and an example of how we implemented the ESPT and actually got really good data back that change national policy in a country. So I'm going to share my screen now. I hope you can see this while I move all these smaller widgets from my screen. Perfect. So managing entomological data is actually really important. Once you collect all this data, what do we do with it? How do we make sure it's of good quality? What can we do with it? What should we not do with it? And a lot of times we collect all this data and people have been like, oh, let me look at your data. Let's make some decisions or try and do an analysis. And I look at this data, and so many times, how do I say this nicely? It's just not that great. Even though you've put in all this effort in collecting it, spent all this money, and the data that comes out and is shared may not be really great data. So a key point is making sure that all this effort you put in actually ends up in some good quality data. So the learning objectives is to understand the basic steps in how to prepare for field or lab data collection, and to identify best practices for data entry, cleaning, and management. And I know this might be a really, really, really boring, boring presentation, but it is very, 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 very important. So we're going to go over how to prepare for data collection, data management, including data entry, cleaning, and storage. And if you look at module 6, it works through one field example. So we're basically in this process where we're looking at data. So when we prepare for entomological data collection, the first step is, once you understand what indicators you need and what you're going to do in the field after you've figured out your plan, the first thing to do is to get your data collection forms. And this is on which we're going to collect all our data. And there are 3 key steps for this, and this is applicable for field or lab. And in academic studies, we absolutely require this. And in a lot of sites for operational studies, I see that it's not done, and that actually hugely impacts the data. If we don't have something to reference, if we don't have something standardized to fill in, what happens is at site A and site B, small differences in data collection that are not documented can have a huge impact on data. And just as a simple example, there were 2 sites that were doing PSCs, so they were going to houses in the morning and collecting mosquitoes that were resting on walls. At one site, the person woke up bright and early and went at 6 in the morning, and by 7 o'clock, they had finished their data collections, and they got a lot of mosquitoes. At the second site, the person was didn't get enough sleep, maybe, let's say that. And they went at 7:30 every day diligently and collected data. And when we looked at the data, one site had a bunch of mosquitoes resting indoors, and the other site did not have any. And we were like, why is this happening? What had happened was that the mosquitoes had left by the time the second person came. came, and the people just told him, just go to the houses and collect data in the morning. And he thought 6 o'clock, 7:30, not a big difference. I need my sleep. And that small change made the data completely different and not comparable. But in your data collection form, you can actually have all that. What time did you go there? You need to go there by 6 p.m. in your SOP, your standard operating protocol. So it's really important to get that done well. So the first step of the 3 steps is to identify what data collection forms you need. For each activity, you need an appropriate data collection form that will record your key data in a standardized way. For example, if you're doing insecticide resistance tests, you must have all your corresponding insecticide susceptibility data collection forms, and all these need to be filled out during the test. If you're looking at insecticide susceptibility, there are WHO forms available. And based on your question, based on what you're doing, get a list, make a list of all the data collection forms you need based on the different field or laboratory and activities that you have planned to do. After being in Indonesia, I'm actually going to Ethiopia, and we're doing training on multiple field activities, multiple mosquito collections. And we have a list of about 20 data collection forms that we're actually going through right now. So we're ready to do the training and ready to collect that data. So everything's standardized right before we start. So the second step is, once we've identified what data collection forms you have, now adapt forms to your activities. You do not have to start these forms from scratch. Many entities, many people, many institutions, countries, PMI, me, we've all have data collection forms that have already been developed, right? WHO has this, CDC, PMI, other people, and you can ask them for it. You don't have to start this from scratch. So what I would do is take these pre-existing forms, and usually they're validated and they've been used for publishing as well. So they are good forms available. And then adapt these forms, take them as templates, adapt them for what you want to do, make them appropriate for yourself, right? And this will ensure that not only are you following validated forms and collecting all the data endpoints, but also using forms that have been used worldwide. So you're not starting from scratch. For example, the 7 o'clock, 7:30 versus 6 in the morning data collection forms, the people who made the forms didn't realize they had to record the time of collections or instruct them to do that. And that is always on a standard PSC form. If you look at the ESPT, there are examples of a few forms. An example of the human behavior observation form is on Annex 4. You can use this form as a template and adapt it to capture exactly what you need. And this is an example of the human behavior observation form. For example, you'd want to look at your locality, your district, your region, the person who's collecting it, your supervisor's name, the collection date, the house number, the homeowner's name, and you might want the GPS coordinates. And in this form, we're collecting the data from 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, 9 to 10. I think it goes on, but let's pretend it stops at 10. The name of the observer, who is collecting the data. Let's say it's Neil Lobo. I'm collecting the data inside. And I'm collecting the number of people at the end of that hour, end of that data collection hour, the end of that HLC hour. We're collecting the number of people who are sleeping under a bed net, not sleeping, not under a bed net, awake, using a bed net, awake, not using a bed net. And now this form can be adapted and changed. For example, let's say your mosquitoes bite at 5 in the evening. You'd want to add an extra row there for 5 to 6 p.m., correct? And let's say people sleep outdoors with bed nets, and that's not on this form. Add that to your form. Outdoor sleeping with a bed net. You can look at multiple things based on your question. Adapt these forms. So this is already done. For example, if you don't have districts, take out your district. If you don't know your GPS coordinates, take out your GPS coordinates. But all these forms, every single one of them, I guarantee you, someone's worked on it. Ask around, find it, use it as a template. The next part is so important as well. Establish data dictionaries for all the data you are collecting. If you imagine all your data is going to be in an Excel spreadsheet, at the top of your Excel spreadsheet, you'll have column headers, right? That say your code or the mosquito species or whatever it is. And underneath that, you'd fill it in. You'd want this to ensure that the appropriate data is collected in a standardized way. And of course, all this data is based on your data forms in the previous slide. It is vital to establish data dictionaries so that we know exactly what every column means, what each data means, and especially what units are present. An easy example is the month, right? If in the US, they put the month before the date. So August 1st would be 8/1. But in, for example, India, it's the opposite. It's the date before the month. So it would be 1/8. So if you have that in a data form, was I in January or was I in August? You will never know unless you have that in the data dictionary. And that's an easy example how things get messed up all the time. And I've seen that so often, right? So for example, if your column header is duration of rainfall, you'd have your description of your column header, what it actually means, and notes in it as well. You can also have units. Did I go over this full slide? Yes. Here's an example. This is data, sequencing data, so lab data from mosquitoes collected in the field. You can see here is the code from Notre Dame. This is the serial number of those samples. This is the code from the site. This is morphological identification of that mosquito species, a collection method. And we can go down onwards and see that each column of this data set is there. But just looking at this, if you did not know anything, what does percent ID mean? What does SR.NO mean? You have no idea. And that is where we have a data dictionary. And this is just an example of a data dictionary. What I do is I always have a contact person to ask any questions. And since I made this sheet, I put my name there. And this is the name of the study, the dates of collection, collection size, just metadata that will help me understand things. And it's all associated with that data file. And here's the data dictionary. Your column header, which is on top, right? The explanation of it and the potential variables. So for example, the SR means serial number, code is your code number, and so on. And so you'd work through that. In collection method, you can see if the code is LT, that means light trap. If it's PSC, it means pyrethroid spray sheet collections. If it's HLO, it means human landing collections outdoors. Excuse the spelling. I obviously made a mistake there. You may smack me. Whenever any of my students or people who work with me come to me without a data dictionary, I send the data back, which means that I need to send this data back to myself because I made a mistake in the data dictionary. Another thing to do is language. So data dictionaries, on the left, you can see it's in English, and on the right, it's in French. It's really easy to replicate this, so you can understand this across different countries, different languages. This data set was collected in France. I'm sorry, not in France, in French, in Mali. And so because Mali is a French-speaking country, we had all the data in French. But since I speak English and je ne peux parler français, I do not speak French very well, we had to have this in English so that we could share the data with non-French speaking people. Another vital component of data dictionaries is things that don't necessarily match what you do. And this is my sort of codes that I use. Please use your own codes. For example, -91 in a cell means I don't know. For example, the sample disappeared and you don't know what happened to it. You might say -91. You don't know what happened to that sample. If you're doing a PCR and the PCR reaction doesn't work, what would you put in that cell? If you're doing an Anopheles, Gambi, diagnostic PCR, and if the reaction didn't work, you cannot say positive or negative. It didn't work. So I'd put in -92. So if I put these codes into those cells, I'll understand what that means. It's really important to always put something in a cell. A blank cell can mean multiple things. A blank cell could mean I did not collect the data, I don't know what the data is missing, or it could mean a 0. And all those different things will impact the analyses different. So I would suggest to always put something in every cell, even if it's just a code that would explain why there's no data in that cell. So data management. This short section will tell us just key things to think about for data entry, cleaning, and storage. So data collected in the field usually is digitized in a database. It's put in your computer. During this process, data cleaning and quality checking is key. It's super important because there's so many mistakes that happen along the way. I have never seen a set of data collected in the field that is completely perfect. Even when I've done it in the field, I always make mistakes. If you think about it, if you're collecting mosquitoes throughout the night, you haven't slept, mosquitoes are landing on your leg, it's dark, you're trying to enter data at the same time, you're going to make mistakes. It's normal. So data cleaning and quality check is really important. Here's an example that I usually ask people to look for mistakes in this data set. On top, we have a collection hour, which is from 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9. We have the time the collections actually started, the temperature, relative humidity, rain, yes or no, wind speed, collector's name, the codes for that hour of collection, and so on. And normally I'd ask you all to identify mistakes, but I'll just go through them. For example, 2302. It should end at 23. That's a mistake in your time, correct? And the next one is 2305. So there's something wrong over there. We need to correct that. Here's an example where they put YN. It should be Y or N, yes or no. Here's an example of empty cell. What does that mean? Was there no relative humidity? Was the data not collected? Did they forget to enter it? Is it on the data sheet? We don't know. And here's another example where the temperature was 300 degrees, which I would not be collecting mosquitoes if it was 300 degrees outside. So recheck it and check the data collection sheet and correct that. So this is just examples of things that could go wrong. I'm going to go through the middle section here first. So we have our raw data that we get from the field. Then we have our cleaned data that we would use for analysis. And those are the two kinds of data, and I save a version of both of them. So we can always go back to the raw data. And your clean data will have explanations of what you cleaned, what you changed, and the reasons why. An important part of data is your institutional review board approvals, your IRB approvals. And of course, this is based on what you're doing, what your data you're collecting. Every country has their institutional review boards, every academic study, every funder. You normally have these institutional review boards that tell you what you can and cannot do with your data. This is country specific. This is based on your study. And so they can change a lot. Our key point is to store your electronic data securely in a database and only have it accessible to the individuals that are approved on the IRB. A lot of times when we have human data, for example, human infection data, we cannot share that because that's personal data. That's human subject research data. So we have to be really careful about what we share, what we can share, and what we absolutely cannot share. For example, for entomology data is usually a little more free to share. So the entomologist, for example, the statistician or the program manager can all have access to this data. In some places, for example, even though it's just entomology data, you cannot share it with a foreigner, for example, or someone outside that country. For example, Indonesia is very protective and the data from Indonesia needs to be stored in Indonesia. It's all country-based. So we want to make sure we follow that country and the rules and the IRB approvals. So this applies to your raw data, your clean data, and your de-identified data. De-identified data means data where we have stripped the data from usually human codes. For example, if we're collecting human data and we're doing interviews on do you like bed nets? And when we collect the data, we have the household and we have the household head's name and so on. A lot of times, if you think about it, if someone came to your house and asked you a bunch of questions, would you like it if they took your name and your answers and shared it with the rest of the world? Probably not. The same applies to everyone else. So we need to respect that person's privacy. We need to respect that person and follow the IRB rules for that data for that person. So that's where we de-identify the data and we remove things like that person's name. We can change that person's name to a code. So we have the raw data with that person's name, the clean data with that person's name, and then we can remove that person's name, replace through the code, and then that is de-identified data. So we don't have data that can be targeted or can be isolated or where a person can be identified. So this will dictate what we can share, what we cannot share, and how secure we need to keep our data. A lot of times people think like, hey, like who would care about the number of mosquitoes in someone's house? But the second it is your house or your family or your opinions, you would care. So we must try and respect everyone, especially because the work we are doing is for this population of people whose data we're collecting. So it's really important to respect their privacy and have these different sets of data. And each set of data might have different sharing rules, right? For example, if we have human data, we cannot share the raw data or the clean data, but we may be able to share the de-identified data based on the IRB approvals. It's important to keep, this is sort of separate from the above statements, it's important to keep historical entomological data from past activities. For example, if there's an IRS campaign 10 years ago, if they were, it's important to keep this so we understand what's happening, what happened in the past. Let's not throw data away because data from 20 years ago can inform what happens or what we do today. For example, if we have not had bed nets at our site for 15 years, and 15 years ago they had bed nets and there was a good impact, we might want to know that. A good Another example I just wanted to mention about data dictionaries that I forgot about and just remembered is that in the 1960s, 70s, there was a huge study in Nigeria. It's called the Garki study. It's a really, really famous study. It was published, there's a book on it, and they have huge amounts of data. And they looked at interventions in the Garki district and they documented so much information. It was a really, really good um, good, uh, good study, a good set of data. And they had collected, I think, 9 species, if I remember correctly, about 9 species of mosquitoes that they coded 1 to 9. Everyone who wrote the Garki data or collected that data is not with us anymore. And right now, when we have this really great data set, we have no idea what species 1 was, or species 2 was, or species 3 was. We assume species 1 is Anopheles gambiae because there are some texts that point to that, but it's Anopheles gambiae SL and not Anopheles gambiae SS or Anopheles arabiensis. And so now we have this gigantic set of data that we don't really understand what is causing what or what had an impact on what, because we don't have that data dictionary that tells us what species was what. And the last thing you want is like 5 years down the line, someone comes and says, hey, you collected this really crazy important data set. Can I please understand it? Can I please have it? And they get it and they cannot understand it because you don't have a data dictionary. The reason for a data dictionary is that I can give you my data, and without you having to call me and ask me what is what, you should be able to understand what the data is. I'm crazy busy. If someone calls me every 20 minutes, hey, Neil, what does this mean? Hey, Neil, what does that mean? I'll go crazy. So it's in your own interest to have a really good data dictionary. I forgot to mention that earlier on. I apologize for it. The last slide after looking at data management is to, again, as Leo asked, to please download the ESPT and the electronic version of the ESPT. We will be going through that tomorrow. And if you Google ESPT MEI, you will reach this page. There are different languages associated with it. You can download each one. It's a PDF form. The Mac download of the little ESPT with the electronic version of the ESPT is available for a Mac. And then the Windows download is also available down there. There are also YouTube videos, as I mentioned earlier on. Go to YouTube and you can find this. And they're all narrated by Mercy. So you can always see Mercy or talk to her down there because her email is here. Any questions or thoughts or comments you had, you can email any one of us on our team, Steve, Mercy, Elodie, and Eddie. And that was the end of that presentation. Do we have any time for quick questions before my last example for today? Perfect. There are two questions on the screen. The first question is, does the size of the human population that an entomological metric represents influence the number of the sampling units, sampling nights you would use? From an academic perspective, yes, especially when you map the mosquito populations over your human populations, right? If it's a really big human populations, how do the mosquitoes map? Is it completely equal over the entire population, or is it differentially, like at one side, is there more mosquitoes than the other side? So you might want to ask that. So based on your question, so what is your question, right? If in your question, the human population would impact your entomological metric, you would want to factor that in. Since we can ask multiple questions where this would actually impact or not impact, I would base it on the question. Look at your question and try and understand that. Again, the more sampling, the better. The next question is, in the prevention of reintroduction context of malaria, is there any minimum entomology recommended based on your limited resources to be used by the program till elimination is declared? So if you're looking for that WHO certificate, I would actually spend a bunch of money on entomology to make sure you don't have any malaria come back, to make sure you get that certificate. And then I would sort of scale back. If you don't have those funds, the least you can do is presence absence, right? The least you can do is receptivity. Are there vectors at my site or not? And if there are no vectors, you're good. If there are vectors, then you'd want to understand where and when transmission may occur, if it does occur. So, and also if your interventions are in place, how they relate to your interventions there. So again, it would be based on your question as well as what your objective is. So over here, if your objective is to get that WHO certificate, just a couple of local cases or one local case, and you won't get that certificate. So if it's important to your country, to your prime minister, or whoever it is, then I would definitely spend the resources to make sure I get that certificate, because that's the objective over here. Any more questions?
Yes, there are several more questions, Neil, but I'm trying to strike a balance between
Okay.
allowing you enough time to give your lectures and dealing with at least some of the key questions. So, like we said earlier on, please, audience members, we don't have enough time to respond to all the questions that come in now immediately. So we deal with a subset of questions, but we will collect all the questions and we hope to answer all the questions at some stage, either in the next couple of days or at the end of the course. Neil, do you have another presentation to give?
One last presentation. I hope I don't go over. So as a quick note, every single day at the end of the day, I look through the presentations and I have been updating them to make them more clear based on how I have been presenting them. And at the end of tomorrow, I will have a complete updated set of presentations that I will share with Leo and Wulan, who can put them online. So they might be slightly different, very slightly different from the ones I'm presenting. And as an addition, everyone in this course, you can use absolutely any of these slides that you want for any purpose you need, and you do not have to ask me. You can just use them, download them, use them. Not a problem with me. So the last presentation for today, and I hope I finish this in time, is an example of application of entomological surveillance using the ESPT and how this actually made a difference. So we're going to talk about malaria in Panama. From 2000 to 2004, malaria had gone down. There were just a few outbreaks. There were about 5,000 cases. And 2016, it went down even further. They were at like about 769 cases and no deaths, which is really good. In 2019, it went up to about 2,000 cases. There were pockets of transmission in remote areas, usually with indigenous populations. And 90% of malaria in Panama were in these areas. On the right, we have a picture of a local indigenous woman there, that they had these really beautiful beaded leg things, decorations. I'm not sure what to call them, anklets, but they're not anklets. They're really beautiful. And if you look at Panama, this is the country of Panama in green. The pink dots represent where malaria is, and where the red arrow is where we conducted this study in this area that had Guna populations. The population was called Guna. This is what their houses look like. This is close to the water. They sort of overlap the water, and if you go slightly more inland, you can see this is what they look like. There's lots of water bodies. This is actually a water body right in front of us, covered in plants, so there are lots of larval sites as well. This is a picture of three Guna ladies. So I was there for a while, and they'd sit there and watch me every day without smiling. And at the end of like a month or something, I was like, God, these women are stunning, sitting there decorated every day. And I went up to them and said, can I take a picture? And for the first time, they all spoke to me and said $10, which I found hilarious. They basically waited a month for me to pay them to take a picture. So in Panama, I'm just going to go over briefly what vectors and interventions there are there. So the Ministry of Health at this point in time used to implement IRS with phenyltrethione. They had been doing this for about 20 years, and there was no insecticide resistance documented. They also conducted larviciding at the site, but there was no real evaluation of larviciding. And bed nets were available in the market. Insecticide-treated nets were available, but the ministry didn't distribute it. And so the question the ministry had were, will L-lines or bed nets be an effective vector control tool at our site? Because they had these pockets of transmission that would not go down. And if you remember on day one, we went over this, how L-lines function and how they do not function. And we formulated our entire entomological surveillance plan based on this question and how bed nets work and how they do not work. How they work on late night indoor biting mosquitoes. They do not function on early evening or outdoor biting mosquitoes. Humans have to be under the nets to be effective. And if they're not under the nets, they're not effective. And mosquitoes have to be susceptible, and they may be to be effective. And if they are resistant, it's not that effective. And so this is what happened. I'm going to go through each one of the stages that we went through earlier on today. So what is our question? Our question was, are bed nets effective? Will bed nets be effective? And towards answering that, we had to divide it into sub-questions. Number one was, what are the mosquito behaviors that align with how bed nets function? What are the human behaviors? Because we want to understand if people are using bed nets, where they are, when they are there. And there's this overlap with what the mosquitoes are doing. And we also want to look at insecticide resistance status, because that's how we'd understand if bed nets were going to be useful. We'd map the human behaviors to the mosquito behaviors. For the indicators, for one, we had two indicators. What are the mosquito behaviors? We'd want to look at the human biting rate inside and outside houses. And we'd also look at what time they were biting, right? And those are the two indicators we'd use. For the indicator for human behavior, we'd look at where they were they inside houses, were they outside houses? Did they use bed nets or did they not use bed nets? When they were asleep, did they use bed nets? And when they're awake, did they use bed nets? And what time did this all happen? So what were people doing inside houses, outside houses? And number three, the third indicator for insecticide resistance status is the insecticide resistance test. So we figured out our question, we figured out our indicators, and our sampling methods now, 1A and 1B, HLCs inside and outside houses would answer what are mosquito behaviors, and would collect the data for 1A and 1B. Sampling method of human behavior observations would tell us about humans, which was your indicator number 2, which would answer the question, what are human behaviors? Larval surveys plus CDC bottle bioassays would answer the question, would be the sampling method to tell us insecticide susceptibility, which would be an indicator, which would answer the question insecticide resistance status. Now, we were trying to figure out our site selection. Since this is the first time anyone was doing this, this would be a baseline survey. And since we plan to do it multiple times, the first survey would be a baseline survey. We'd go back to that survey, back to the sites, and it would turn into a routine survey. We wanted to ideally have 5 key sampling sites, and each site may have separate cultural inhabitants because we knew human behaviors differed by culture, by the local inhabitants. We wanted to do 5 sites. And our sampling design was that we do this over 1 year, go back 5 times, and each time we went back, we'd look at 5 sentinel houses. So we'd go back to those houses each time, and each time we do 10 days of collection. So we'd go to 5 sampling sites 5 times a year, 5 houses each site, and 10 days of collection each sampling point. And of course, then now we had our ideal sampling design, our sampling framework, what we want to do. And we went to the National Malaria Control Program and discussed it. And we only had $50,000 for our project. And unfortunately, that was not enough money. And as I said, we had to go back to the question to try and understand what to do. And this is what happened. We decided that we were not going to look at insecticide resistance status to save some funds because they really didn't implement a lot of bed nets there. And there's a second question we were going to ask where we were going to look at insecticide resistance with IRS, but that's a second question. So we didn't include that over here. We took it out. We kept all these indicators in because these are the minimal essential indicators except IRR tests which were taken out. I forgot to put a strike through IR test, so I apologize for that. This will be one of the changes in the final set of PowerPoints that I share. For sampling methods, we kept these in minimal essential sampling methods to collect our minimal essential indicators. We took out larval survey and the CDC bottle assays, as I mentioned. For site selection, instead of going to 5 sites, we just whittled it down to 2 key sampling sites, each with different cultural inhabitants. Instead of going 5 times a year, we went to 3 times per year. We did keep 5 sentinel houses, but only 5 days of collection each time. And this fit within our 50,000 budget envelope. And this was our final plan that we wanted to implement to answer our question, will bed nets be useful at our site? And now I'll go over the data and hopefully I love these slides. So I hope you'll like it. So this worked. And so this is the vector behaviors, 2 sites. At site 1 on the left, we have the number of mosquitoes, anopheles, per person per hour. And from 1 to 13, we started collections at 5 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. We went 1 hour early because the mosquitoes were biting then. And you can see the green is biting rate outdoors, the red is biting rate indoors. Basically, most of the mosquitoes are biting outdoors, even though they're biting indoors and outdoors. Site 1 and 2, over time, they actually had the same mosquito biting rates. So even though these figures look slightly different, actually most of the human landing and the human landing catches was happening outdoors early in the evenings, and there was less biting indoors than outdoors. And you can see that from these figures. Now, when we look at the human behavior observations, I'm going to go through this in a little bit of detail. The green line means people outdoors. It's the same thing over here. We have 5 p.m. to 6 a.m. over the course of the night. And over here, we have the proportion of people from that house, right? So you can see most people were outside. 90% of people from that house were outdoors in the evening. And then and that number went down because people were going indoors over the course of the night. And over here, you can see they started waking up and going outdoors again. If we look at people indoors awake, that's the blue line. You can see people over here going indoors as the number of people going out, number of people outdoors goes down, the number of people going indoors goes up, and these are awake, remember? So this number goes down as they go to sleep, and you can see over here, they start waking up just a bit. And these are the number of people, the red line, asleep, not under bed nets. So you can see they're all going to sleep here, and these are the people not using bed nets. And this is the number of people asleep under bed nets. So you can see a lot of people over here are not using bed nets. And this is in site 1. You now know the name of the site, Permeana Chukuna. So just from this, we can see what people are doing. And just from this, you can imagine where people might be exposed or not exposed, right? Now we can take the number of people or the proportion of people at each of these hours and add them up by behavior. And what we get is this little pie chart here. The proportion of time people spend in each of these behavioral groups. I hope that makes sense. So for example, all the red, the proportion of people added up over every hour will be the red over here. You can make a pie chart from this. And this is what we find. Over the course of the night, in site 1, most of the people are inside asleep, not under a bed net. The blue is the people inside awake. The green is the proportion of time people spend over the night outdoors. And the purple is the proportion of time people spend protected by bed nets. And this is just looking at human behavior. We haven't even thought about entomology yet, right? Or rather, we have thought about entomology, but we haven't combined the two. Now, just from this, it actually can tell us a lot about what's happening at that site. Now let's do the next thing. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this. At site 2, we have the same, we collect the same data from site 2 for the people, but you might notice that this looks slightly different. And this is really important. I was amazed by what a big difference this made because this is just 2 different cultures. In site 1, people went to sleep earlier than site 2. By a couple of hours, and just small difference. And I would normally ask you this, but this was based on this site 2 having electricity and site 1 not having electricity. So site 1, it got dark, they went to sleep. Site 2, they had electricity, they actually used more bed nets because they could afford more bed nets as well. So these small differences in 2 communities that were actually really close to each other made a huge difference. And I can show you what happened. So, whoops. Do you remember this slide where we overlap how the intervention functions with vector behavior and human behavior? This is exactly what we did at the site. We took the intervention, which is bed nets, and we mapped that to what vectors are doing. We looked at vector behaviors, then we looked at what humans are doing. Are they outside? Are they inside asleep with bed nets? Are they inside awake or inside asleep without bed nets? And over here, we can then say, this proportion is protected and this proportion are not protected, and that's a gap in protection. And how we get this is this. We combine our mosquito behavior with our human behavior, and this is simple to do. I don't think I have the time to go over these calculations and how to do them, but it's really simple. Message me if you want it. I'll shoot you an email with all the descriptions. So we combine the two, and what we find is the adjusted biting rates by behavior. The red, or let's do the green first. The green is the adjusted biting rates outside based on human behavior. So even though most of the mosquitoes are biting outdoors, this is the biting rate outdoors based on the community and what they're doing. The blue is the biting rate indoors when people are awake. The red is the biting rate indoors when people are asleep without bed nets. So even though most of your mosquitoes are biting outdoors, most of your exposure are the red and blue lines, and that's happening indoors. If you remember me sitting outside in Papua getting chewed up by mosquitoes, a ton of mosquitoes, while everyone was asleep under their bed nets, it's almost a similar thing, right? The human landing rates I was doing was not reflective of what was happening in the community. The human landing rates up here in green were not reflective of actual exposure happening to the community. Now we can take this figure and do the exact same thing and make a pie chart, which I'll get into the next slide because I forgot about this slide. At site 2, when we combine the mosquito behavior with the human behavior, we find the exact opposite, that most of the exposure was outside, not indoors. So we have almost the same mosquito population, the same higher biting rate outdoors, but based on the human behavior, based on electricity, based on people staying outside later, based on them going to sleep later, based on them using bed nets more, the exposure was happening outdoors. And this was amazing to me because humans actually dictated where and when transmission was happening. Most of the transmission at site 2 was happening outdoors early in the evening, and most of the exposure happening at site 1 was indoors earlier in the evening, slightly later than site 2, but when people were indoors, either asleep or awake. And when we do a pie chart with it, this is what we see. How much of exposure is coming from where? In site 1, most of it was indoors when people were asleep without bed nets, and indoors when people were awake. And about a quarter of it was outdoors, slightly less than a quarter. However, at site 2, based on human behavior, about 30% of it was indoors when they're awake or indoors without bed nets, and most of it was outdoors early in the evening. So automatically now you can look and see where transmission is happening. And now, if you think about this just a little bit more, you can actually see what interventions might work in these spaces and at these times. And that's exactly what we did. We went to the Ministry of Health and said, hey, at site 1 and site 2, this is what's happening. At site 1, bed net use. If you increase bed net use, you can protect them when they're sleeping without bed nets. When they're awake without bed nets, we can possibly give them spatial repellents or topical repellents. Outdoors, right now, there's not much we can do, but maybe we can give them topical repellents, spatial repellents, or do a larval source management or increase larviciding. The same thing we can apply to site 2, right? Understand where and when transmission is happening, what people are doing, and what intervention might work in those spaces, right? And so we went to the Ministry of Health, and what they said was, hey, the only thing we can actually do right now based on WHO recommendations is increase bed net use. So they had a trial where, this figure on the left for site 1 is exactly the same as the figure on the left for March of 2019. And this is what the exposure profiles were in March of 2019. And what they did is they did bed net distribution plus social behavior change communication. So they asked the communities, they told them, look, this is our data. This is where you're being exposed to malaria. If you use these bed nets that we're giving you, your exposure will go down. And this is what happened in July to August 2019. How many months is that? March, April, May, June, July. 4 or 5 months later, the exposure to mosquitoes went down hugely and changed at site 1. So this is, of course, relative exposure. So the red, you can see the red went down to half, to this tiny sliver. The blue went actually down. And even though this looks like a huge increase, it's not an increase. It's proportionally, the green remained the same. And this is actually the real data. So this is the figure I showed you in the previous slide. Pre-bednet, post-bednet. Pre and post, the outdoor exposure remained the same. Pre and post, the indoor exposure when people were asleep without bed nets went down because people were using their bed nets. And what happened was with the social behavior change communication, people realized that, hey, I should go under my bed net not to get bitten. And they actually were inside awake less and went under their bed nets more. So that further decreased the exposure here. And the ministry was like, whoa, like this small amount of data, this small, like 3 collections over the course of a year, if you remember our sampling frame, resulted in this really great data set that reduced exposure in these target communities with a distribution of bed nets. So the question was, are bed nets an effective vector control tool at these sites? And the answer is, bed nets are an appropriate and effective tool, but are not sufficient as a sole intervention, because while understanding how good bed nets are, we have also understood our gaps in protection, where bed nets will not work. And this little red sliver is where bed nets worked. It went down to that. Bed nets do not work when people are awake and not on their bed nets, and bed nets will not work outdoors. So even though we drastically reduced exposure, we can actually see where the continued gaps in protection are. Even with this great strategy, we now have to combat the malaria in these sections, and other interventions must be included to address these identified gaps in protection. I hope that made sense. That was the example. And there was actually an article about this, and where these communities where malaria went down, they were happy, the ministry was happy, and bed nets changed. It changed the bed net policy in Panama. The second example I'm going through very, very quickly, because I hope you can see how the logical framework, how to work through this problem, how we work through this question, rather. The second question they asked, because they had IRS for a long period of time, is IRS an effective vector control tool at our site? And IRS works on indoor resting mosquitoes. IRS does not function on outdoor resting mosquitoes, correct? We're looking at this the same way we looked at bed nets. Mosquitoes have to be susceptible to the insecticide for IRS to have a community impact. If mosquitoes are resistant, it might not be that effective. And we went through the exact same process. What is the question? What are our indicators? Our sampling methods? So to answer, what are the mosquitoes' indoor resting behaviors? We would collect the indicator of indoor resting rate, and we do indoor aspirations inside houses. What is the insecticide resistance status? We'd look at insecticide resistance, and we do larval sampling for insecticide resistance tests with the CDC bottle bioassay. And since IRS was already implemented, we wanted to look at the impact on exposure, right? Where and when were people actually being bitten in the site with IRS? And what we did was human behavior adjusted biting rates, which were HLCs plus HBOs. And that's the sampling methods, HLCs plus HBOs. In the same way as the previous BedNet study, please note this was at the same sites. We did a baseline survey that turned into a routine survey. We had 5 key sampling sites with 2 separate cultural inhabitants. And as before, we wanted to do 5 time points, 5 sentinel sites each time, sentinel houses each time, and 10 days per collection. We had only $50,000 again, and we could not afford it. The Ministry of Health did say that insecticide resistance tests were required for this because they had been conducting IRS for 20 years. And so we had to redo our entire strategy based on the question, and that's what we decided on. Now, please note the ones in blue, we were already approved to do through the HLCs, through the previous question on bed nets. So technically, please note we can answer multiple questions with the same indicators, with the same sampling methods. So the blue on this was not included in the budget for the IRS because we were already doing it, and we can use that data for this if we use the same sites. And that's exactly what we did. We used 1 site instead of 5, and we used these same sort of reduced numbers in the sampling design, except instead of 5 sentinel houses, we could actually afford 15. So we had a better sample size. So 3 points in 1 year, 15 sentinel houses each site, and 5 days of collection each time point. We actually did 3 houses per day at each time point. So we could do 15 houses total over each time we went to visit. We could afford this, and we were going to do the insecticide resistance tests. And the quickest version of what happened on one slide is over here. The question is IRS an effective tool? The main things we wanted to ask are the mosquitoes resting indoors? And so we conducted, actually not PSCs, but indoor aspirations, as well as HLCs in and out to understand where the exposure was alongside human behavior. So what we found is that when we're doing PSCs or indoor aspirations, there were 0 mosquitoes resting indoors. I think over all the collection time points, we found 1 Anopheles resting indoors, and it was a male. And that male must have been confused or lost, but that male didn't count. And when we're looking at indoor landing rates and biting rates, in the HLCs, we were finding 7.8 mosquitoes biting indoors per night. And outdoors, we are finding 30 mosquitoes per house per night. So mosquitoes were coming inside to bite people. Mosquitoes were outdoors biting people. But of the 38 mosquitoes coming to a house, 0 of them were resting in the house. And please note, we use different houses for the PSCs, 15 of them, and we use different houses for the HLCs. So we didn't contaminate our sampling methods. When we looked at insecticide susceptibility, where are the mosquitoes susceptible or resistant to the insecticide, phenithrothion, what we found is that the mosquitoes were 26.3% of them survived. which means, according to WHO, that they were resistant. So now when we look at this, how does IRS function? IRS functions on indoor resting mosquitoes, and none of them were resting indoors. IRS functions on insecticide susceptible mosquitoes. They were not susceptible, they were pretty resistant. And now the outcome of this is that IRS, after 20 years, is probably not that great an intervention at that site. And this actually caused a pretty big kerfuffle in Panama and changed policy with regards to IRS as well. So that's the shortest version of that. There's a publication on this that looks at this study. If you wanted to look at it, please note that the person in charge of malaria for Panama, his name is Mario Avia. And I have to say, he was instrumental. This is the person, Mario Avia. He was instrumental in pushing everyone all the time to do a good job. He said, we have to do this. He tried to get everything approved. He did such a great job that we managed to actually do the study with $50,000 and produce his data set. And he pushed changes in policy to protect his people. And I'm saying Mario Avia's name a lot because a single person, and that's him, can actually have a huge difference. And he made that difference in Panama. And the key messages, my final points, and I'm so sorry for being 5 minutes over time, is that understanding gaps in protection is vital because from this, just this example of this study, we can see where protections happen, where they don't happen, and what interventions we need, and what interventions may be useful. It'll inform decisions about appropriate interventions. An important part of gaps in protection is also you can understand how much an intervention will function as well as how much it won't. For example, if someone says, hey, put in this new active ingredient or this new kind of bed net into your site, your expectation should not be we're going to get rid of malaria. If you do these studies appropriately, your expectation can be at the maximum, because you'll understand it, at the maximum, I can get malaria down 30%. If it's not 30%, how can I optimize it, right? So that is a huge component of this. What are your expectations? If you have this data and someone comes to you with a new product and be like, hey, this is a great product. Our studies demonstrate this, this, and this. You can say, great, I would like to evaluate it. But I want to understand how much it would function in our context. And after you actually understand that, you can say, hey, your intervention is only going to impact 10%, 30%, 50% of transmission at our site based on what's happening at our site. So you can understand that and you can be in charge of it and go to Global Health, Global Fund, go to donors with this set of data, telling them how much impact you can expect to have with these interventions. Evidence-based decisions will reduce transmission. There's no buts about it. And you can actually use the SPT that's actually changed policy. And this is important. Key point being Mario Avia in Panama. You, based on how you function, how you make decisions, how you think through processes, you can make a difference. And I'm done for today. Sorry for being 7 minutes late.
Not quite, Neil. We're going to ask you if you wouldn't mind having a look at just 3 questions.
Oh, sure.
If you don't mind.
Yeah. The first question is, I wanted to get your perspective on using electronic forms for entomological surveys. Have you found them to be efficient and effective in your experience? If so, are there any tools or platforms you would recommend? So the answer to this is yes and no. It completely depends on where you're working and what is suitable for that site. Some sites are more open to using electronic data forms and some sites are not. We very effectively use electronic data forms in Kenya and Tanzania, but not so much in other countries. And it completely depends on what that country is used to, what the program is used to. There are multiple factors that affect how comfortable a person is to use, for example, a phone, right? If they're not used to phones and not used to scrolling through phones, it might not be effective. But if they are, it might be really effective, or a tablet for that matter. There are multiple platforms. There are a couple, and I don't want to specifically suggest one or another right now, but if you look at WHO, there are a couple of suggestions there with DHIS2, for example. There are a couple out there that you can actually look at and try and see what's most suitable if you want to evaluate it. If you were going to implement it, I would evaluate it in a small scale implementation trial to see how effective it might be. You probably don't want to do a full scale implementation of a new tool without understanding everything you need to do to have it function effectively. I hope that was an okay answer.
Yeah, Neil, the second one I put in, because you've already spoken about this, but I get the impression there's still some confusion and uncertainty. And maybe you can just say something, repeat, just to, reinforce what you said previously about these sampling sites and so on. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, how many times should we conduct entomological surveillance in active foci, residual and non-active foci, and cleared foci, and post-elimination to stratify receptivity? So so there are multiple questions in here, right? I'd say the first thing would be your budget that would dictate it, but your question would also dictate it. If you're just trying to understand receptivity and you don't have any transmission, and if you don't have a big budget, all you're looking for is presence, absence of larvae, and you can do that once or a couple of times during the high transmission season, even though there's no transmission, right? So you're just looking, hey, does my site still have larvae or not? If you're looking at areas that are non-active, where there's no transmission, you could do a similar thing just to make sure you're keeping tabs on what's happening. Of course, the more funds you have, the more you can conduct more surveillance points, the more structures, the more sites you can have. When they're active foci, uh, again, this is based on your question, right? If you're just looking at receptivity, the active foci, which means you don't have to look at receptivity, there are anopheles transmitting malaria there. But if you're looking at where and when mosquitoes are biting, it again completely depends on your question. I know this is a bit vague, but if you had a specific question, if you had a specific scenario, I can try and approach the question better. So if you in the question box, if you had said, hey, this is my situation, this is what I'm going through, this is the situation, what would you think? And I can try and give you options or the thought processes or the logical framework within which you can try and get a best decision moving forward. Yeah, I'm sorry. This question is a little harder to answer because there's no actual question in it that can direct what I would say, except for the receptivity. Because if you had, it's either yes or no. You're either receptive or you're not receptive.
Question 3 is basically the same as question 1, Neil. My apologies.
Yes, yes. Oh no, that's fine. Yeah,
we can skip that. Yeah.
yeah.
So Neil, again, a master at work. I'm sure our audience will agree that, this again was an excellent session that we all thoroughly enjoyed, benefited from, learned a great deal, easy to listen to, easy to understand. If anything, it's just, we're bombarded with such a wealth of information, trying to absorb it and process it is the challenge. And that is why it's so important to know that all these presentations have been or will be uploaded onto YouTube and also the Orient.org website. And Wulan and Dr. Porn have listed those URLs in the chat box. I'm not sure if it's possible for Wulan or Dr. Porn just to screen those URLs. Very important for you to have access to that, to have a look at it again and refresh yourselves, because there's a mountain of wonderful information available in these lectures that will make you a far more effective and confident practitioner in vector control, vector surveillance. So for that, we thank Neil very much for, sharing his experience and, expertise with us. And we look forward to more tomorrow. Tomorrow, there's going to be yet another session And we look forward to our audience again, linking in and sharing in this wonderful experience. Thank you, Neil. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to Wulan and Dr. Porn for the technical background work that you are doing. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.